The straps are already tight before Isaac Clarke understands where he is. A man in a straitjacket wakes up strapped to a chair in a room with padded walls, and the first face he sees isn't a doctor. It's someone he doesn't recognize, telling him to stay calm. Right before that, someone's throat opens up and something wet and wrong crawls out of him. 3 years have gone missing from Isaac's life. He doesn't know how he got here. He doesn't know why his hands are bound. He only knows that whatever kept him safe in the dark is now gone, and something worse has taken its place. This video is not a recap of what happens in Dead Space 2. It's an examination of how the game convinces you to trust a narrator whose own mind is actively lying to him, and why that trust becomes the sharpest weapon the story has. By the end, you'll understand exactly how a game about space monsters became one of the most accurate portrayals of guilt, grief, and institutional betrayal ever put into a controller. If you find something in this video that connects with you, drop a comment and tell me what part did it. Maybe it was a specific detail. Maybe it was a moment that hit closer to home than you expected. Some of my favorite video ideas have come directly from things you've suggested. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's step into the sprawl. Chapter 1. A Mind That Isn't His Own. Isaac Clarke wakes up strapped into a straitjacket, staring into the face of a man named Franco DeLille. Franco is trying to get him out. He doesn't get the chance. Something bursts out of a nearby vent, latches onto Franco, and turns him into a necromorph in seconds, right in front of Isaac. Isaac is defenseless. His arms are pinned, all he can do is run. That single image tells you almost everything you need to know about the next several hours. Isaac isn't given a weapon first. He isn't given answers first. He's given helplessness, and he's forced to move through it anyway. 3 years have passed since the disaster aboard the USG Ishimura, the ship from the first game. Isaac has spent those 3 years as a patient inside a psychiatric hospital on a space station called the Sprawl, built into what's left of Saturn's moon Titan after the moon was hollowed out and mined for its resources. Isaac has no memory of most of that time. He doesn't remember arriving. He doesn't remember years of treatment. He only remembers Franco's death and the outbreak that follows it. Losing 3 years of memory is not just a plot device. It mirrors something real. Severe trauma can disrupt the way memories are stored and retrieved, especially when that trauma involves prolonged captivity or repeated psychological distress. The brain sometimes protects itself by failing to properly encode what happened, leaving gaps that feel less like forgetting and more like waking up in the middle of someone else's life. Isaac isn't confused because the writers wanted a mystery box. He's confused because his mind did what traumatized minds sometimes do. It shut the door on years it couldn't process. What makes this worse is that Isaac isn't just missing memories. He's actively losing trust in his own senses. Early in the outbreak, doctors and staff around him mention that he's been diagnosed with a form of dementia tied to his exposure to an alien object called a marker, the same artifact responsible for the horror aboard the Ishimura. This isn't ordinary dementia. It's described as a condition that produces vivid hallucinations, distorted thinking, and a slow unraveling of the difference between what's real and what isn't. And it's framed by the people running the station as something that could eventually kill him. Think about what that means for a story built entirely around what Isaac sees. Every hallway, every scream, every flicker of movement in his peripheral vision could be real, or it could be his own collapsing mind. The game never gives you a clean way to tell the difference. Neither does Isaac. Keep that uncertainty in mind as we go, because it's going to come back in ways that change how you see almost everything that happens after this point. The hospital itself becomes a character in this opening stretch. It's not just a location. It's a symbol of a system that was supposed to help Isaac and instead became another cage. He was brought there after surviving the Ishimura, a survivor of unimaginable horror, and the people responsible for his care used that same trauma to extract information from his mind for their own purposes. We'll get into exactly what those purposes were later. For now, understand this. Isaac wakes up in a straitjacket inside a facility meant to heal him, and within minutes that facility is trying to kill him instead. The betrayal isn't subtle, it's structural. It's baked into the walls before a single necromorph shows up. If you're wondering why a horror game would spend its opening minutes on helplessness instead of firepower, that answer becomes clear pretty quickly. Isaac spends this entire first stretch relearning how to survive from nothing. No weapon, no plan, no idea who to trust. Just a straitjacket, a burning hallway, and a body that used to belong to someone he almost knew. Chapter 2: The Mind That Turns Against Itself. Once Isaac escapes the initial outbreak in the hospital wing, a woman named Daina Le Guin guides him toward safety and gives him information nobody else has offered. She tells him it's been 3 years. She tells him that the director of the station, a man named Tiedemann, built a second marker using knowledge pulled directly from Isaac's brain. And she tells him that his dementia isn't just disturbing, it's lethal, and she claims she has a way to cure it. That word, dementia, gets used a lot in this story, and it's worth slowing down on what it actually means here, because this isn't the same thing as age-related cognitive decline in the real world. In Dead Space, marker dementia describes a psychological deterioration caused by prolonged exposure to the marker signal. It produces whispers, visions, and eventually full-blown hallucinations that can become violent. Some people affected by it are driven to suicide, others become homicidal, and in Isaac's specific case, the signal doesn't just distort his perception, it uses his own grief as raw material. That's the detail that makes this different from typical horror monster logic. The marker doesn't manufacture some random nightmare to torment Isaac. It reaches into the one wound he never closed and pulls a shape out of it. That shape is Nicole Brennan, Isaac's girlfriend, who died aboard the Ishimura in the first game. Nicole appears throughout Dead Space 2 as a hallucination, and she is by far the most consistent presence in Isaac's disintegrating world. She talks to him, she touches him. In some moments she comforts him, and in others she turns on him with violence, once even lunging at his own eye with a needle while he's forced into a desperate struggle to survive the vision. There's something quietly brutal about that specific detail. The hallucination doesn't come dressed as some alien horror. It comes wearing the face of the person Isaac loved most, and it uses that face to hurt him. In real psychological terms, this pattern resembles something researchers call intrusive traumatic imagery, where a person who has experienced profound loss or trauma experiences unwanted, vivid mental images connected to that loss, often triggered by stress or reminders of the original event. These intrusions aren't chosen, they arrive uninvited, and they can feel every bit as real and physically threatening as they do to Isaac in this game. The difference is that most people experiencing this don't have their intrusive imagery capable of physically attacking them. Isaac does, because in this story his mind isn't just replaying grief. It's being actively used against him by something external that understands exactly which memories will cause the most damage. This is where the game does something a lot of horror stories don't bother attempting. It doesn't ask you to be scared of a monster hiding an event. It asks you to be scared of your own memory turning into a weapon, aimed at you, by something that knows you better than you know yourself. And here's the detail that should unsettle you a little more the longer you sit with it. Isaac believes, for a long stretch of this story, that these visions of Nicole are entirely the marker's doing, some outside force hijacking his mind. He treats them as invasion, something planted in him rather than something that came from him. That belief becomes important later because it isn't the full truth, and the moment that truth gets revealed changes the entire emotional shape of this story. We're not there yet. Keep that thread in your mind, because it's going to unravel slowly, the same way Isaac's grip on reality does. Chapter 3: The Face That Won't Let Go. To understand why Nicole's hallucination hits as hard as it does, you have to understand who she was before any of this happened. Nicole Brennan was the senior medical officer aboard the USG Ishimura during the outbreak that defines the first game. 2 years before that mission, she and Isaac had entered a relationship. When the Ishimura needed a chief medical officer, Isaac pushed her to take the assignment. Believing it would be good for her career, she accepted, and shortly after the ship went dark, cut off from communication, exactly at the point their conversation was interrupted. During the outbreak aboard the Ishimura, Nicole tried to help as many survivors as she could, even attempting to stop the spread of the infection. but by the time Isaac reached her, she had already taken her own life. Isaac spends most of the first game unaware of this, hallucinating her as alive, guided by a marker signal that used his hope to keep him moving toward its own goals. By the time Dead Space 2 begins, Isaac knows Nicole is gone. What he doesn't know, at least not consciously, is how much responsibility he still assigns himself for her death. He was the one who encouraged her to take that posting. He was the one who wasn't there when everything fell apart. And grief, when it's tangled up with guilt like that, doesn't behave the way clean textbook grief does. It doesn't fade in stages. It loops. It ambushes you in unrelated moments. It attaches itself to the person you loved and turns them into something you're both terrified of and unable to let go of. That's exactly what happens to Isaac. The hallucination of Nicole isn't simply a ghost. She's guilt with a face, guilt with a voice, guilt that can grab him by the throat. Picture the moment where the hallucination slams Isaac against a wall in the halls of the station, demanding he answer honestly why he can't let her go. It isn't a monster asking that question. It's the exact question Isaac has likely been avoiding inside his own head for 3 years, given form and volume by something that knows precisely where to press. If that sounds like an unusually intimate kind of horror for a video game about space zombies, that's because it is. Most horror asks you to fear something outside yourself. This story slowly reveals that the real threat was never fully external to begin with. Isaac isn't just fighting a marker's influence. He's fighting the parts of his own mind that never got the chance to process what happened to the woman he loved. We're going to see this dynamic escalate as the story moves forward, and it's going to get worse before it gets any better. But there's a specific reason it doesn't fully resolve here, and that reason has almost nothing to do with the marker itself. It has to do with a decision Isaac made 3 years ago, before any of this outbreak began. One connected to Nicole in a way most players don't clock the first time through. We'll get to that decision eventually, and when we do, it's going to reframe everything you thought you understood about why Isaac's guilt runs this deep. That explains why the hallucinations exist. It doesn't explain why Isaac, specifically, out of everyone exposed to the marker's influence, becomes the one person it needs alive rather than dead. The answer to that is a lot more uncomfortable than simple bad luck, and it's going to force us to look at the people running this station instead of just the man trying to survive it. Chapter 4: The Man Who Thinks He's Saving Everyone. Tiedemann is the human being most directly responsible for the horror unfolding on the sprawl, and he genuinely believes he is doing the right thing. Tiedemann is the director of operations for Titan Station, and he also heads a project called Project Telomere, an EarthGov research program studying the markers. According to information found in the game, Tiedemann believed that humanity's dependence on planet cracking, the destructive process used to strip apart moons and planets for resources, would eventually lead to extinction unless people learned to understand and harness the markers instead. In one recorded log, he states plainly that reliance on planet cracking cannot continue, and that the markers may be the only path left for humanity to survive. That belief is what drives him to authorize the construction of a second marker, using information pulled directly from Isaac Clarke's mind. Over the 3 years following Isaac's rescue, Tiedemann and his scientists extracted the blueprints and codes for the marker from Isaac and another survivor, Nolan Strauss, and used that stolen knowledge to build what the game refers to as the Sprawl's own marker inside the government sector. Sit with that for a moment. Tiedemann isn't hiding behind ignorance. He isn't a man who stumbled into catastrophe by accident. He looked at the same evidence that turned the Ishimura into a slaughterhouse in the first game, and he decided the risk was worth taking anyway, because in his mind the alternative was slow extinction through resource collapse. This is where the story becomes less about monsters and more about the kind of reasoning that allows otherwise capable people to greenlight disaster. Tiedemann isn't stupid. He isn't cartoonishly evil either. He's someone who convinced himself that a catastrophic risk was an acceptable price for a possible future benefit, and he had the authority to make that call for over 1 million people who never got a vote. There's a name for this kind of thinking in psychology and ethics. It's sometimes described as a form of motivated reasoning, where a person facing a difficult or threatening reality selectively focuses on evidence that supports the outcome they already want, while downplaying evidence that contradicts it. Tiedemann wanted a future where humanity wasn't dependent on planet cracking. That desire shaped how he weighed the danger of rebuilding a marker, even after watching what one already did to an entire ship of people. Once the marker is completed inside the government sector, the consequences arrive almost immediately. According to the game's story, citizens across the station, especially children, begin showing signs of dementia and aggression. Waves of homicide and suicide follow, echoing what happened aboard the Ishimura and on Aegis 7 in the first game. The infection spreads from there, and the station Tiedemann swore to protect becomes the site of a second outbreak, this one entirely of his own making. Here's where things get more complicated than a simple story of one man's arrogance. When the outbreak begins, Tiedemann declares martial law and orders a full evacuation of the station's civilians. According to information from the game, this evacuation order went directly against instructions from his EarthGov superiors, who wanted the incident covered up rather than acted on. Tiedemann chose to save as many people as he could, instead of following the chain of command that told him to let them die quietly. At the same time, his superiors ordered the elimination of the people connected to the Marker project, which included Isaac, Nolan Strauss, and a woman named Lexine Weller. Tiedemann is the one who gives that order to his security forces, turning Isaac into a hunted man on the same station he's desperately trying to survive. So which version of Tiedemann is the real one? The director who defies his own government to save a million strangers, or the man who authorized the very disaster that put those lives at risk in the first place, and who now wants Isaac dead to cover it up? The honest answer is both, at the same time, without contradiction resolving either way. That's what makes him more disturbing than a simple villain would be. A purely evil administrator would be easy to dismiss. Tiedemann is harder to dismiss, because his worst decision and his most selfless one come from the exact same place, a conviction that he alone understands what's necessary, and that other people's consent isn't required for him to act on that conviction. Graffiti-covered posters of Tiedemann appear throughout the station during the outbreak, suggesting he was already deeply unpopular among the population, particularly among Unitologists, before any of this began. Whatever trust existed between this director and the people under his authority had already been damaged long before a single necromorph appeared. Keep this pattern in your head as we go further into this story, because Tiedemann is not the only authority figure making decisions for people who never agreed to the terms. There's an entire institution behind him that operates on a much older and much larger version of the same logic, and understanding where that institution came from is going to change how you see everything Tiedemann does for the rest of this story. Chapter 5: A City Built on Something That Was Torn Apart. Before we go further into what happens on Titan Station, it helps to understand exactly what kind of place this is, because the sprawl itself is not just a backdrop, it's a physical monument to the exact desperation that drives Tiedemann's decisions. Titan Station, known informally as the Sprawl, is a space station built into and around the last remaining fragment of Titan, one of Saturn's moons. According to the game's background material, Titan was the site of the very first planet crack, a mining process where a moon or planet is deliberately broken apart to extract its resources on a massive scale. The Sprawl was constructed encircling what was left of that moon after the process finished, and by the time of the story, it houses a population of over 1 million people, complete with schools, shopping centers, apartment towers, and a large Unitologist church. There's something quietly unsettling about that detail once you actually stop to picture it. An entire city, with families, classrooms, and grocery stores, built directly around the leftover fragment of a world that was intentionally destroyed for parts. The Sprawl isn't just located near evidence of humanity's resource hunger. It is that evidence, wrapped in shopping malls and painted over with the ordinary rhythms of daily life. Tiedemann's own words, found in his recorded logs, describe planet cracking as something humanity can no longer sustain, warning that without understanding the markers, there may be no hope left for the species. Whether or not that claim is accurate within the world of the story, it tells you exactly what kind of pressure shaped every decision that follows. This isn't a director acting out of simple greed or cruelty. He's operating from a belief that his civilization is running out of time, standing on top of literal proof of how far that civilization has already gone to delay the inevitable. This is where the game does something that a lot of science fiction stories skip past. It doesn't just give you a haunted space station, it gives you a haunted space station built from the wreckage of an entire moon, populated by people going about ordinary lives without any apparent awareness of what their home actually represents. Real-world history offers something worth thinking about here. Cities and communities have often been built on top of land with violent or exploitive pasts, whether that's contested territory, sites of forced labor, or environments damaged by resource extraction. Life continues on top of that history because most people don't have the luxury of confronting it daily. They have jobs to get to, children to raise. The unresolved past becomes a foundation nobody looks directly at, because looking directly at it would mean stopping everything else to deal with it. The sprawl operates the same way, until the day it can't anymore. The station is physically split into two main sections, the public sector and the government sector, connected by structures called crossover tubes. The public sector is where most civilians live, work, and shop, while the government sector houses EarthGov offices and the research facility where the second marker is being built. That physical separation matters more than it might seem at first. The people whose lives are most directly endangered by the Marker project, the ordinary residents of the public sector, have almost no access to or knowledge of what's actually happening in the section of the station making decisions on their behalf. That's not an accident of architecture. It's a reflection of exactly how power tends to organize itself in situations like this. The people making the riskiest decisions are physically and structurally insulated from the population who will absorb the consequences if those decisions go wrong. When the marker's influence begins spreading anxiety and violence through the civilian population, most of those people have no idea a second marker even exists. They just know something is wrong, and they have no way to trace that wrongness back to its source. By the time the outbreak fully takes hold, and Tiedemann's evacuation order goes out, the very layout of the station that was designed to separate governance from population becomes an obstacle to survival. Crossover tubes meant for orderly transit turn into choke points. A city built around the bones of a destroyed moon becomes a trap for over 1 million people who never had a say in any of the decisions that put them there. The sprawl doesn't just host this story's horror, it explains it, and once you understand what this station is built on top of, both literally and institutionally, it becomes a lot harder to see the coming outbreak as some random misfortune. It looks a lot more like something this place was always eventually going to produce. There's one more institution woven through all of this that we haven't fully unpacked yet. One that existed long before Tiedemann, long before the sprawl, and long before the second marker. Understanding where that institution actually came from is going to reframe almost everything happening on this station, because the truth behind it is very different from what its own followers believe. Chapter 6. The Religion Built on a Murder. Throughout Dead Space 2, you'll notice Unitology everywhere. Posters, a large church on the sprawl, merchandise, believers who preach openly and without shame, treating their faith in the marker as self-evident truth. To understand why this religion has so much influence over the events unfolding on this station, you need to understand where it actually came from, because the true origin is very different from what its followers believe. According to the game's background material, Unitology was founded on the discoveries of a geologist named Michael Altman, who first encountered a marker known as the Black Marker roughly 2 centuries before the events of this game. Altman was part of a team that studied the artifact at a research facility, and he eventually made the decision to reveal its existence to the public, believing the truth was being suppressed. Shortly after going public, Altman was found dead. The official Unitologist belief holds that Altman was assassinated by the government to silence him, that his death was punishment for exposing the truth about the marker, and that his martyrdom is the foundation of everything the church now teaches. Followers pray to him, They call him the way and the light. They believe that through something called convergence, all of humanity will eventually become unified as one being through the power of the marker, achieving a kind of eternal life beyond individual death. Here is the part that most casual players never learn, because it isn't shouted from the pulpit inside the game's own church. According to the game's lore, Altman was not a willing prophet. He was murdered by the men who had been working alongside him during the original research. These two men were the ones who actually believed in the marker's supposed divinity, and after Altman's death, they built an entire religion in his name, one he never asked for and never agreed to lead. Markov, who had worked at the same research facility, was later recorded in an interview reflecting on Altman's death and the founding of Unitology, describing how the loss of Altman was spun into a story of martyrdom that fueled the church's rapid growth. According to the game's lore, Stevens and Markov released only the parts of Altman's research and public statements that supported the story they wanted to tell, allowing the world to believe he was a willing prophet rather than someone who had been silenced by the very people posing as his followers. Read that again. The founding tragedy that gives Unitology its entire moral authority, the martyrdom that its billions of followers pray to and organize their lives around, was constructed by the same people responsible for the death they claim to be avenging. Unitology isn't built on a lie about what happened to Altman. It's built directly on top of the crime itself, repackaged as sacrifice. This is a pattern that shows up again and again throughout human history whenever a movement needs a martyr more than it needs a truth. A death gets reframed to serve whoever controls the story afterward. The people telling that story rarely have to answer for how convenient it is that the narrative benefits them specifically. By the time enough people believe the official version, questioning it doesn't feel like curiosity anymore. It feels like blasphemy. That's exactly what happens with Unitology. 2 centuries after Altman's death, the religion built in his name has grown into one of the most powerful institutions in this fictional universe, with deep influence inside EarthGov itself and enormous financial resources. According to background material connected to the game, high-ranking members of the government are believed to be Unitologists, blurring the line between the religion supposedly fighting government oppression and the government it claims to be resisting. Now think back to everything we just covered about Tiedemann and the sprawl. A director convinced that humanity's survival depends on understanding the markers. A city built on the wreckage of a destroyed moon, still hungry for the resources the markers might one day provide, and running underneath all of it, a religion that has spent 2 centuries convincing billions of people that a stolen death was actually a divine sacrifice, all in service of encouraging humanity to keep pursuing exactly the kind of power the markers represent. None of these 3 things exist in isolation. Tiedemann's desperation and Unitology's faith are pointed at the exact same object for different reasons using different language, but with the same basic hunger underneath. One calls it survival, the other calls it salvation. Isaac Clarke is standing directly in the middle of both, and neither side particularly cares what happens to him as a person, only what he represents. That explains why so many powerful people on this station want something from Isaac. It doesn't explain why Isaac isn't fighting this battle alone. 2 other people are trapped in the same nightmare he is, and one of them is walking down a path that Isaac himself only barely avoided 3 years ago. Understanding what happens to that man is going to make everything Isaac goes through a lot harder to watch. Chapter 7. The Mirror Isaac Can't Look Away From. Nolan Strauss was once a senior scientist working for EarthGov, assigned to a team connected to the events following Aegis 7. His job, hidden from most of the crew, was to recover pieces of the marker from Aegis 7 and study what remained after the disaster in the first game. He found a fragment. He studied it, and slowly the same signal that unraveled Isaac's mind began unraveling his. According to background material connected to the game, Strauss grew obsessed with the fragment, believing it held answers about the nature of the necromorphs and humanity's purpose. His obsession deepened until the marker's influence pushed him into a state where he could no longer tell the difference between the people he loved and the monsters hunting the ship. Overwhelmed by hallucinations, Strauss ended up killing his wife and young son, believing in that moment that they had already become something else. Sit with that for a second, because the horror in that detail isn't really about the act itself. It's about the fact that Strauss wasn't a stranger to his family in that moment. He was still their husband and father, still fully present in his own mind, watching what he believed were monsters, while his hands did something his heart would have never allowed if his perception had been intact. The tragedy isn't that a monster killed his family. The tragedy is that Strauss, still convinced he was protecting them, became the monster instead. Afterward, according to the same sources, Strauss tried to convince himself that his family was safe, that he had somehow rescued them rather than harmed them. When questioned about what happened, he avoided giving a clear account, refusing to revisit the memory directly. That kind of response lines up with something real-world psychology recognizes in survivors of trauma they themselves caused. When a person's actions violate their own sense of who they are, the mind sometimes protects itself by refusing to fully process what happened, creating a kind of psychological distance from an event too painful to hold in full detail. Strauss wasn't lying to other people when he insisted his family was fine. He appears to have been lying to himself, because the alternative was unbearable. Following the outbreak on the O'Bannon, Strauss was captured and transferred to Titan Station as part of the same research initiative that had already claimed Isaac. Both men, exposed to different fragments of the same artifact, became living archives of information EarthGov wanted extracted. For 3 years, according to the game's background material, Strauss underwent sessions designed to pull marker blueprints directly from his mind, the same process inflicted on Isaac, until both of them were placed in stasis to build what would eventually become the station's own marker. Now think about what it means for Isaac to encounter this man again once the outbreak begins. Strauss isn't a stranger presenting a new threat. He's a preview. He's what happens to someone who was exposed to the marker, lost the people he loved because of it, and never found a way back from that loss. Isaac is looking at his own possible future every time Strauss opens his mouth to recite the fragmented instructions his unraveling mind insists are the key to salvation. As the story progresses, Strauss's condition worsens. He becomes increasingly hostile, first toward Ellie, then eventually toward Isaac himself. In one of the story's hardest moments to sit with, Strauss attacks Ellie and takes her eye, a moment fueled entirely by his own collapsing grip on reality, rather than any conscious cruelty. Shortly after, his mental state deteriorates completely, forcing Isaac into a confrontation that ends with Strauss's death at Isaac's own hands. Here's the detail that should stop you before you move past it too quickly. Isaac doesn't kill a monster. He kills a man who, 3 years earlier, was doing exactly what Isaac himself was doing, trying to survive contact with something that reached directly into grief and turned it into a weapon. The only real difference between them is how far each man's unraveling was allowed to go before someone stepped in. That's not comforting. It's not supposed to be. Strauss exists in this story as proof that Isaac's own outcome was never guaranteed. He could have easily ended up exactly where Strauss did, and there's no clean explanation in the source material for why one man's mind held together long enough to keep functioning while the others came apart completely. Sometimes survival isn't about strength or character. Sometimes it's just about which version of the damage you happen to receive. That answers why Isaac is haunted by more than his own grief on this station. It doesn't answer why a woman with no connection to the marker, no history with Isaac, and every reason to walk away instead chooses to stay by his side through all of it. Understanding what actually drives her is going to complicate the idea that anyone on this station is simply good or simply broken. Chapter 8: Staying Without a Reason to. Ellie Langford enters this story already having lost everything that mattered to her before Isaac even shows up. She's introduced as a Class 4 heavy equipment pilot, working for the Concordance Extraction Corporation, a mining company operating in the Sprawls sector. When the outbreak begins on the Sprawl, Ellie is leading a group of co-workers trying to reach safety in the government sector. According to the game's background material, her group's numbers steadily dwindled as the necromorphs closed in, until she was left as one of the few, if not the only survivor from her original team. By the time Isaac encounters her, Ellie is already deeply reluctant to trust anyone. She fires her plasma cutter at him without warning, tells him not to follow her, and makes it clear she believes trusting other people gets you killed faster than trusting no one. That reaction isn't paranoia without cause. According to background sources, she had already been betrayed by others during the early chaos of the outbreak, watching people she depended on fail her or die around her. There's a specific psychological pattern worth naming here, one that shows up frequently among survivors of group disasters. It's sometimes called survivor's guilt, a persistent and often irrational belief that a person should have done more, or that they don't deserve to have made it out when others didn't. Ellie displays signs of this throughout the story, having been the one member of her crew who escaped a location where nearly everyone else died. That kind of guilt doesn't always look like sadness on the surface. Sometimes it looks exactly like what Ellie shows us early on, a hardened refusal to let anyone close enough to become another name she has to carry. And yet, despite everything pushing her toward isolation, Ellie doesn't stay isolated. She eventually allies with Isaac, and later takes on the burden of protecting Strauss, a man whose mental state is clearly deteriorating and who poses an obvious risk to anyone near him. This decision costs her dearly. During Strauss's final and most severe breakdown, he attacks her, taking one of her eyes in the process. According to background sources, her reaction afterward is strikingly calm, focused more on practical survival than on dwelling in the trauma of what just happened to her. That reaction tells you something important about how Ellie has learned to process pain by this point in her life. She doesn't perform grief for anyone watching. She adapts, adjusts, and keeps moving, because stopping to fully absorb every loss would mean never being able to function again. It's a coping strategy built entirely out of necessity rather than emotional health, and the story never pretends otherwise. Ellie's choice to stay through all of this, to keep protecting Strauss even as he becomes more dangerous, to keep fighting alongside Isaac even after losing an eye for it, isn't framed as heroism in any simple sense. It's framed as one survivor recognizing something familiar in another survivor and choosing connection anyway, despite every instinct telling her that connection is exactly what gets people killed. By the end of the story, Isaac makes a decision that reveals just as much about his own psychology as it does about Ellie's. Believing his fate is sealed, Isaac sends Ellie away to safety alone, choosing to face the marker by himself. According to a personal journal entry found later in the game, Isaac later admits that his need to save Ellie stemmed directly from his failure to save Nicole years earlier, an attempt to rewrite an old loss using a new person as the canvas. Ellie doesn't accept this. She defies his attempt at self-sacrifice, piloting a gunship back into the collapsing station to pull him out anyway, refusing to let him decide her fate on her behalf. That single choice says more about who Ellie is than almost anything else in this story. She isn't willing to be someone's redemption arc. She isn't willing to be saved as a substitute for someone else Isaac couldn't protect. She comes back on her own terms because she decided to, not because Isaac needed her to represent something. Keep that distinction in mind, because it becomes important later when we look at exactly how far Isaac's guilt over Nicole reaches into every decision he makes for the rest of this story. For now, understand this. Ellie survives Titan Station not because she's untouched by what happens there, but because she's willing to keep choosing connection even after every experience she's had should have taught her not to. That explains why Isaac finds an ally instead of walking through this alone. It doesn't explain why the person who first reaches out to help him turns out to want something far darker than rescue. Understanding what Daina Le Guin was actually after is going to make you question every offer of help this story presents from that point forward. Chapter 9: The Kindness That Was Never Real. Daina Le Guin is the first person to offer Isaac real help after the outbreak begins, and that help is a lie from the very first message she sends him. Daina makes contact with Isaac shortly after Franco's death, offering to guide him to safety and, more importantly, promising that she can cure the dementia slowly killing him. For a man who has just woken up with 3 missing years and a straitjacket around his arms, that offer is almost impossible to refuse. According to background sources, Isaac is initially reluctant to trust her, But after enough encounters with the necromorphs overwhelming the station, he reaches out to her as his best remaining option. Throughout their communication, Daina explains what happened during Isaac's missing years, tells him about Tiedemann's construction of a new marker, and warns him that EarthGov now considers him a target. Every piece of information she offers turns out to be true. That's what makes her eventual betrayal land as hard as it does. She isn't lying about the state of the station or the danger Isaac faces. She's lying about her reason for helping him survive it. When Isaac finally reaches her, the truth comes out immediately and without softening. Daina reveals herself as a high-ranking member of the Church of Unitology, and according to background sources, she explains that her promise of a cure was never real. What she actually wants is access to Isaac's mind, specifically the marker blueprints embedded there from his contact with Marker 3B during the events of the first game. Unlike Tiedemann and EarthGov, who see Isaac as a liability to be eliminated, Daina and the Unitologist need him alive, intending to use him to construct new markers and spread them throughout human space. This is where the story quietly delivers one of its most disturbing ideas, and it's easy to miss if you're moving too fast through the plot. Isaac spends this entire opening stretch being hunted by two separate factions who want completely opposite outcomes for him, and both of them are willing to use deception, manipulation, or outright violence to get it. Tiedemann wants him dead to protect the Marker Project's secrecy. Daina wants him alive to expand it. Neither one sees Isaac as a person with his own right to safety or autonomy. They see him as a resource, valuable specifically because of the damage already done to his mind. There's something worth naming here about how institutions and movements often treat individuals who possess something they need, whether that's specialized knowledge, a particular skill, or in Isaac's case, literal information trapped inside his own memory. The moment a person becomes valuable for what they contain rather than who they are, their own well-being tends to become secondary to whatever goal the people around them are pursuing. Isaac isn't being pursued because anyone on this station cares whether he lives or dies as a human being. He's being pursued because his mind holds something other people want badly enough to lie, kidnap, or kill for it. Daina's fate arrives quickly once her betrayal is revealed. An EarthGov gunship attacks the location where she's holding Isaac, and according to background sources, she is killed in the resulting assault, along with her accomplices. Her death isn't framed as a moment of justice or catharsis. It happens almost incidentally, a side effect of two larger institutional forces colliding with each other, with Isaac caught directly in the middle. That detail matters more than it might initially seem. Daina doesn't die because Isaac defeats her in some meaningful confrontation. She dies because the machinery of institutional conflict she was participating in eventually turned on her, the same way it was always going to turn on Isaac, given the chance. She spent her final moments believing she was serving something larger than herself, a belief that Unitology had spent 2 centuries carefully cultivating in exactly the way we covered earlier in the story. And in the end, that belief bought her nothing except being caught in the crossfire between 2 institutions that, on some level, wanted exactly the same thing she did. By this point in the story, Isaac has now been betrayed, hunted, and manipulated by nearly every authority figure and institution he's encountered since waking up. A director who wants him dead, a church that wants him harvested, a woman who offered comfort as bait. The only person who hasn't asked anything of him beyond simple survival is Ellie, and even that relationship, as we covered, comes with its own complicated weight. This pattern of betrayal isn't incidental to the horror of this story. It's the actual foundation the horror is built on. The necromorphs are frightening, but they're honest about what they are. Every single human institution Isaac encounters on this station, by contrast, wears the language of help, cure, salvation, or protection, while pursuing something entirely different underneath. That gap between what people say they're offering and what they actually want is where this story's deepest tension lives. And it's about to get a lot more personal once Isaac is forced back into the one place he spent 3 years trying to forget. Chapter 10: The Machinery of Betrayal. There is a moment in Dead Space 2 that is easy to move past too quickly, because it happens in the middle of chaos, surrounded by gunfire and collapsing infrastructure. Isaac Clarke, already exhausted, already bleeding from 100 small cuts this station has given him, receives new orders from Hans Tiedemann's command channel. The station's own government wants him dead. Not captured, not questioned, dead quietly, so that whatever happened here can be buried along with him. Take a step back from the plot for a moment and just sit with what that actually means. Isaac Clarke did not choose to come to this station. He was brought here after surviving one disaster, placed in the care of an institution that was supposed to treat him, and used without his knowledge or consent as raw material for a project that eventually caused a second disaster identical to the first. And now that same system of authority wants him erased, not because he did anything wrong, but because his continued existence is inconvenient to the people who created this mess in the first place. This is not incidental horror. This is the actual architecture the entire story is built on top of, and it deserves its own space, separate from any single character, because the pattern repeats so consistently across this game that it stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like the whole point. There is a concept in psychology that explains exactly what is happening to Isaac throughout this entire story. Freyd is the psychologist credited with developing the idea of betrayal trauma, a term she uses to describe wrongdoing committed by an institution against people who depend on that institution for safety, support, or survival. According to her research, institutional betrayal includes not just direct harm caused by an organization, but also failure by that organization to prevent harm or respond to it honestly once it happens. Read that definition again, slowly, and then think about the hospital Isaac wakes up inside at the very start of this game. He was placed there as a survivor of catastrophic trauma. The institution responsible for his care used that same trauma to extract information from his mind, kept him in a state of induced memory loss for 3 years, and then, when the inevitable disaster occurred because of that extraction, ordered his death to keep the whole project quiet. Every single piece of that sequence fits Freyd's definition of institutional betrayal almost exactly, point for point. What makes this idea so useful for understanding this story is a second concept Freyd developed alongside it, something she calls betrayal trauma theory. According to her research, betrayal trauma occurs specifically when the people or institutions someone depends on for survival are also the ones causing that person harm, creating a situation where the victim cannot fully process or acknowledge the betrayal, because doing so would threaten their ability to survive within that relationship. Freyd's own research points out something important here. The severity of psychological harm caused by a betrayal is not just about how bad the act itself was. It is heavily influenced by how close and how necessary the relationship was between the victim and whoever committed the betrayal. A stranger causing you harm is painful. Someone you were required to trust for your own safety causing you harm reaches somewhere deeper because it does not just hurt you, it removes the ground you were standing on. Isaac's entire ordeal on the sprawl fits this model almost perfectly. He was not harmed by a random attacker with no connection to him. He was harmed, repeatedly, by the exact systems that were supposed to be protecting him. A hospital that experimented on him instead of healing him. A government that hunted him instead of investigating what actually went wrong. A woman who promised him a cure and instead planned to use his own mind as raw material for spreading the exact disaster he had already survived once. Each of these betrayals lands harder specifically because Isaac had no real choice but to depend on these systems in the first place. He did not choose the hospital. He did not choose to be a research subject. He was simply a person caught inside institutions with far more power than he had. Institutions that decided his usefulness mattered more than his consent. Now widen the lens for a moment, because this pattern does not stop with Isaac specifically. It runs through the entire population of the sprawl. Remember what we covered earlier about the layout of this station. A public sector filled with over 1 million ordinary people, living their lives with schools and shopping centers and the daily rhythms of a normal city, separated by crossover tubes from a government sector where Tiedemann's Marker project was being built without their knowledge. These people were never told a second marker was under construction directly above the lives they were building for themselves. They were never given a choice about the risk being taken with their safety. According to the game's own story, once the marker's influence begins spreading anxiety and violence through the civilian population, most of the people affected have no idea what is causing it, no way to trace their sudden fear or aggression back to a decision made in a section of the station they have never even seen. This is institutional betrayal happening at a massive scale, not against one man specifically, but against an entire city of people who trusted their government to at minimum tell them the truth about the risks being taken with their lives. And crucially, according to background sources, when the outbreak begins and Tiedemann's own superiors within EarthGov become aware of what is happening, their first instinct is not to warn the population or contain the danger honestly. It is to order the killing of everyone connected to the project, Isaac included, and to keep the entire disaster hidden from wider public knowledge. The people responsible for creating this catastrophe respond to it not with accountability, but with concealment. There is a term connected to Freyd's research that describes exactly this kind of institutional response, and it is worth naming directly because it shows up again and again once you start looking for it, both in this story and in real-world examples of institutional failure. The term is DARVO, an acronym standing for Deny, Attack, Reverse Victim, and Offender. According to Freyd's research, this pattern often appears when an institution or individual responsible for wrongdoing responds to being confronted not by taking responsibility, but by denying the harm occurred, attacking whoever is raising the concern, and then reframing themselves as the true victim of the situation. You can see fragments of this exact pattern in how EarthGov handles the unfolding disaster on the Sprawl. Rather than acknowledging that their own secret marker project caused a second catastrophic outbreak, the institutional response is to eliminate the evidence, meaning the people, and maintain whatever official story keeps the truth from reaching the public. Isaac becomes a loose end to be tidied away, not a victim of institutional negligence, deserving protection or even basic honesty about what was done to him. Here is where the story becomes genuinely difficult to sit with, because Tiedemann himself does not fit cleanly into this pattern the way EarthGov's higher command does. Remember what we covered earlier. Tiedemann defies his own superiors and orders a full evacuation of the civilian population once the outbreak begins, an act that directly contradicts instructions to let the disaster quietly run its course. He is, in this specific moment, choosing something closer to institutional courage, a term Freyd uses as the direct opposite of institutional betrayal, describing actions an institution or its representatives take to protect the people depending on them, even at personal or professional cost. But Tiedemann is also the person who authorized building the second marker in the first place, using stolen knowledge from Isaac and Strauss's minds without their consent, fully aware of what a marker had already done aboard the Ishimura. He is simultaneously the architect of the exact disaster he later tries to contain, and one of the only people on this station willing to risk his own position to save civilians once that disaster begins. He does not fit neatly into either the betrayer or the protector category. He occupies both at once, and the story never resolves that tension into something simpler. This matters because real institutional betrayal rarely looks like a single obviously evil person making obviously evil choices. It usually looks like people convinced they are managing an impossible situation the best way they know how, making decisions that genuinely harm the people depending on them, while still believing, at least partially, that they are serving some larger good. Tiedemann's own recorded logs describe his belief that continued dependence on planet cracking would eventually doom humanity, and that understanding the markers might be the only alternative. From inside his own perspective, building that second marker was not reckless disregard for human life. It was a calculated risk taken specifically because he believed the alternative, doing nothing, guaranteed a worse outcome eventually. That belief does not undo the harm his decision caused. It complicates it in a way that mirrors how institutional betrayal actually functions in the real world, far more often than most people assume. The people responsible for institutional harm are rarely cartoonish villains twirling a mustache while plotting cruelty for its own sake. They are far more often people who convinced themselves that the risk they were taking with other people's safety was justified by some larger goal. a goal that conveniently always seems to require sacrificing someone else's well-being rather than their own. Now bring Daina Le Guin back into this picture because her betrayal of Isaac operates on a slightly different mechanism, one just as important to understand. She does not present herself to Isaac as a distant bureaucratic authority, making difficult calculations about acceptable losses. She presents herself as someone who cares specifically about him, offering comfort, information, and the promise of healing at the exact moment he is most desperate and most alone. According to the game's own dialogue, she gives him accurate information about what happened during his missing years, accurate warnings about the danger he is in, and completely false promises about her actual intentions. This is a particularly insidious version of institutional betrayal because it does not rely on cold indifference. It relies on manufactured warmth, specifically engineered to lower Isaac's guard at the exact moment he most needs someone to trust. Betrayal trauma theory helps explain why this specific kind of manipulation causes such deep harm. According to Freyd's research, betrayal is most damaging when it comes from someone the victim was relying on for genuine care or protection. Daina understood this instinctively, whether or not the story frames it in those exact clinical terms. She built a relationship with Isaac specifically designed to feel like the one honest connection in an otherwise hostile environment, and then revealed that connection was constructed entirely to serve an institution's goals, not his well-being. There is a concept related to all of this worth naming as well, something Freyd's research calls betrayal blindness. According to her work, this describes the unawareness, the not knowing, and sometimes the active forgetting that people exhibit toward betrayal, particularly when acknowledging that betrayal fully would threaten a relationship or a system they depend on to survive. Isaac displays fragments of this throughout the early parts of this game. He knows almost immediately that trusting a mysterious voice promising him a cure is risky. He follows her instructions anyway, not because he is foolish, but because the alternative, having no one to trust at all in the middle of a second necromorph outbreak, is nearly impossible to sustain psychologically. Betrayal blindness is not stupidity. It is often a survival mechanism, a way of tolerating dependence on systems or people who may not deserve that dependence, because the alternative of trusting no one leaves a person even more exposed and even more alone. This same mechanism explains something about the wider population of the sprawl as well. According to background details we covered earlier, graffiti-covered posters of Tiedemann appear throughout the station, suggesting real, visible distrust existed among residents even before the second outbreak began. And yet that same population continued living ordinary lives directly on top of a city built from the wreckage of a destroyed moon, continued trusting a government that had already given them reasons for suspicion, because functioning day-to-day requires a certain amount of trust in the systems around you, even systems you have reason to doubt. Full awareness of every institutional risk surrounding you at all times is not sustainable. People build lives on top of uncertainty because the alternative is paralysis. This is where the deeper thesis of this entire story becomes visible if you step back far enough to see the whole shape of it. Every major character Isaac encounters across this game is, in some way, either the product of institutional betrayal or the instrument of it. Strauss was extracted, studied, and discarded by the exact same project that claimed Isaac. Ellie lost her entire team while working for a corporation that treated her and her co-workers as expendable labor in a dangerous environment. Daina was shaped by an institution, the Church of Unitology, whose entire foundation, as we covered earlier, was built on manufacturing a martyrdom out of a murder its own founders committed. Even Tiedemann, the man giving the orders, is operating inside a chain of command that ultimately values secrecy over the lives of the people it claims to serve. None of these people exist outside the systems that shaped them. All of them are, in different ways, casualties of institutions that use trust as a resource to be extracted rather than a relationship to be honored. And Isaac, at the center of all of it, becomes the clearest example of what happens to a single person forced to absorb the accumulated cost of every institution around him, deciding again and again that his well-being was negotiable. There is something worth connecting here to real-world patterns beyond just individual psychology, because institutional betrayal rarely happens in isolation. Freyd's research and the wider body of work built on her theories point to something important. Institutions that fail one group of dependent individuals tend to fail others as well, because the underlying culture that allows betrayal to happen once, prioritizing the institution's reputation or convenience over honest accountability, tends to repeat itself whenever a similar situation arises. This is exactly what happens across the wider Dead Space story. The same pattern of secrecy, experimentation, and institutional self-protection that created the disaster aboard the Ishimura repeats almost exactly on the Sprawl years later, not because anyone learned nothing from the first catastrophe, but because the underlying institutional incentives, protect the project, protect the secrecy, protect the people at the top, never actually changed. That repetition is the real horror sitting underneath everything else in this story. Necromorphs are frightening because they are visceral and immediate. Institutional betrayal is frightening because it is patient, because it does not require a single moment of dramatic villainy to cause catastrophic harm, and because it tends to repeat itself precisely because the people benefiting from the system rarely have strong enough incentive to change it. Isaac survives Dead Space 2. He escapes the Sprawl, destroys the Marker, and gets out alive alongside Ellie. But surviving institutional betrayal is not the same as being protected from it happening again, and the wider story of this franchise, the years Isaac spends afterward still sketching Marker blueprints he cannot explain, still carrying a sensitivity to the signal that never fully leaves him, suggests that the damage done by these systems does not simply end once the immediate crisis is over. It becomes part of the permanent architecture of who a person is afterward. The same way institutional betrayal in real life often leaves lasting marks long after the specific institution responsible has been left behind, closed down, or simply moved on to its next project. That is the quiet, uncomfortable truth sitting underneath every chase sequence and every hallucination in this story. Isaac was never just fighting monsters on this station. He was fighting the accumulated weight of every system that used him, lied to him, and decided his life was an acceptable cost for someone else's larger plan. And the most unsettling part of all of it is how familiar that pattern feels once you stop watching it happen to a fictional engineer on a fictional space station and start recognizing the shape of it in how real institutions, again and again, tend to treat the people who depend on them most. Chapter 11. Coming Home to the Worst Place on Earth. For the first several hours of Dead Space 2, the Ishimura sits quietly in the background. According to the game's art director Ian Millam, the ship is visible early in the story, docked and waiting, a deliberate choice meant to plant a single unsettling question in the player's mind. Are they really going to send Isaac back there? That question sits unanswered for most of the game on purpose. Millam has explained that the development team specifically chose to delay the return to the Ishimura as long as possible, letting the anticipation build rather than delivering the confrontation early. By the time Isaac is finally forced to board the ship again, he isn't walking into a surprise. He's walking into a threat he's had hours to dread. That structure mirrors something real about how anticipation works on the human mind. Fear of an upcoming event, especially one tied to past trauma, often does more damage than the event itself. A person forced to return to a place connected with something terrible doesn't just relive what happened there. They spend the build-up rehearsing every possible version of what might happen this time, and that rehearsal can be more exhausting than the actual confrontation. Isaac spends this entire game with the Ishimura sitting in view, a constant reminder of unfinished business he never asked to revisit. Once Isaac finally boards the ship, according to the game's chapter details, he checks its status from the same terminal he used during the first game, before moving through the flight deck, the tram tunnels, and eventually the engineering deck. Along the way, according to background material, distorted audio logs can be found describing what happened when the original Marker was brought back to the Ishimura, along with accounts of insomnia and worsening nightmares among the crew before the first outbreak began. These recordings are so degraded, that most players need subtitles just to understand what's being said. There's something almost too precise about that detail. Memory connected to trauma often doesn't arrive clean either. It comes distorted, fragmented, missing pieces, requiring extra effort just to make sense of what actually happened. The ship's own recorded history mirrors the condition of Isaac's mind at this exact point in the story, both of them holding on to damaged versions of events too painful to store intact. According to the same background sources, remnants of Isaac's own earlier survival strategies are still visible aboard the ship. In the area where Isaac first obtained his plasma cutter during the original outbreak, the words "cut off their limbs" remain written on the wall above a work table. A message left behind from his own hand during the original outbreak, still legible, still true, still legible, still true. It's a small detail, easy to miss, but it means Isaac isn't just walking through a location connected to his trauma. He's walking past physical evidence of exactly who he had to become in order to survive it the first time. As Isaac makes his way deeper into the ship, his hallucinations of Nicole become noticeably more severe, according to the game's own chapter breakdown. This isn't presented as coincidence. The environment itself appears to intensify whatever pull the marker's influence still holds over him, as though proximity to the place where everything began is dragging his unresolved grief closer to the surface. By the time Isaac reaches the ship's tram system, now without gravity due to damage sustained since the first game, he's forced through a disorienting zero-gravity passage before finally reaching the bridge. There, according to the walkthrough details, he activates the ship's centrifuge, a mechanical action that becomes critically important later in the story, before escaping the Ishimura entirely. Just as he leaves, he receives a transmission revealing that Ellie is under attack from an increasingly unstable Strauss, immediately pulling the story's tension from Isaac's internal crisis back into the external threat closing in on the people he's trying to protect. This entire sequence works because it refuses to let Isaac, or the player, simply move past his history. Trauma in this story isn't something Isaac defeated once and now carries as a scar. It's a location he can be physically forced back into, with all the same dangers waiting, along with new ones layered on top. Healing, if that word even applies to what Isaac experiences, was never going to be as simple as surviving the first encounter and walking away changed for the better. Chapter 12, When Your Own Memory Becomes the Threat. One specific moment inside the Ishimura sequence deserves closer attention, because it reveals something important about how this story constructs fear differently than most horror games attempt to. According to Visceral's audio director Andrew Boyd, a jump scare within this section of the game was deliberately designed to replicate the exact sound effects used during an encounter with the Hive Mind, the massive controlling necromorph entity from the first game's story. Boyd has explained that this specific callback was intended to prompt an emotional response from Isaac and, by extension, from the player, forcing a question neither can easily answer. Can Isaac actually trust what he's perceiving anymore, given how blurred the line has become between reality and his own hallucinations? This detail matters because it clarifies something worth being precise about. The scene isn't presenting the actual hive mind as a returning physical threat within Dead Space 2. It's using sound, specifically sound Isaac's mind associates directly with one of the worst experiences of his life, to trigger a reaction rooted entirely in memory rather than a real, present danger. The horror isn't the monster. The horror is what a single familiar sound does to a mind already primed to expect the worst. This is an incredibly accurate representation of how trauma response actually works in real psychology. A specific sound, smell, or sensation connected to a traumatic memory can trigger a full physiological fear response even when no real threat is present. This is sometimes described as a trauma trigger, where the nervous system reacts to a stimulus associated with past danger, as though that danger is happening again in the present moment, regardless of what's actually occurring around the person. Isaac hears something that sounds like the hive mind, and his body and mind respond as though he's back in that exact life or death moment from years earlier, even though the source of the sound is something else entirely. That's a remarkably specific choice for a horror game to make deliberately, and according to Boyd's own comments, it was constructed with exactly this psychological effect in mind. The goal wasn't simply to startle the player with a loud noise, it was to make both Isaac and the person controlling him question the reliability of their own senses in a moment that felt, for just a few seconds, indistinguishable from real danger. There's a broader idea buried inside this specific design choice, one worth sitting with for a moment. When someone survives something severe enough to reshape their nervous system's baseline sense of safety, the world afterward doesn't simply return to feeling neutral. Certain sounds, certain rooms, certain kinds of silence can all become loaded with meaning they never carried before. For Isaac, the Ishimura isn't just a location filled with old memories. It's an entire environment built out of trauma triggers, each one capable of pulling him backward into a moment his mind never fully processed the first time. That helps explain something about the escalating hallucinations we covered in the last chapter. Isaac's grip on reality doesn't weaken here because the marker's influence is simply growing stronger in some abstract sense. It weakens because every single element of this specific location, the sounds, the sights, the layout of the halls, is actively working against his ability to stay grounded in the present moment. Once Isaac finally escapes the Ishimura, that instability doesn't resolve. It follows him directly into what comes next, into the final and most dangerous confrontation of the entire story, one where the difference between what's real and what's hallucination stops being a question Isaac can afford to get wrong. Chapter 13. The moment everyone becomes one. Once Isaac makes his way into the government sector near the end of the story, everything that's been building throughout Dead Space 2 converges, quite literally, into a single catastrophic event. According to the game's plot details, Isaac deliberately releases the doors, holding back a massive gathering of necromorphs, allowing them to overwhelm Tiedemann's remaining security forces standing between Isaac and the marker. This isn't a mistake or an accident. It's a calculated decision, one that results in the deaths of the soldiers blocking his path, using the very horde he spent the entire game fighting as a weapon against the people trying to kill him. As the necromorphs reach the marker itself, the event Unitologists have spent 2 centuries anticipating finally begins. According to background sources, this event is called convergence, described within Unitology's own belief system as humanity's final unification into a single collective being through the power of the marker. For the Church, this has always been framed as salvation, the fulfillment of everything Michael Altman supposedly died, revealing to the world. What the game actually shows during this moment is very different from anything resembling peaceful spiritual unity. The necromorphs gathering at the marker triggers what the story presents as a large-scale, violent event, threatening to consume everything and everyone connected to it, including Isaac himself as the person whose mind originally carried the marker's blueprint. This is where the story's central irony fully reveals itself. Unitology has spent generations describing convergence using language of wholeness, unity, and transcendence. What's actually depicted is something closer to systemic annihilation, individual identity being erased and absorbed into something far larger and far less consenting than the peaceful merging church doctrine promises its followers. The gap between what a belief system promises and what actually happens when that belief system gets its wish is about as wide as it's possible to get. To stop convergence from completing, Isaac has to use a device to unlock the marker data still embedded in his own mind, a process that pulls him into a confrontation happening entirely within his own head. There, he's forced to face the hallucination of Nicole one final time, now revealed as a projection the marker has been using throughout the entire story specifically to guide Isaac toward completing convergence by merging with the artifact he unknowingly helped create. We're going to spend real time in the next chapter unpacking exactly what happens during that internal confrontation, because it's arguably the emotional center of this entire story, the moment where guilt, grief, and manipulation finally collide directly with Isaac's ability to choose something different for himself. For now, understand the shape of what's happening around him. An entire station, over 300,000 people, has been pulled toward a single catastrophic event built on top of a religious promise founded on a lie, orchestrated by an administrator convinced he was saving humanity, and triggered by a decision Isaac himself made just moments earlier when he chose to unleash the very horror he'd spent the whole game running from. Nothing about this climax happens in isolation. Every institution, every betrayal, every unresolved piece of grief we've covered across this entire story funnels directly into this single moment on the sprawl, and the way Isaac chooses to fight his way out of it is going to tell you exactly what kind of person 3 years of captivity, manipulation, and loss actually left behind. Chapter 14: The Anatomy of a Manufactured Faith. There is a specific kind of horror that never once takes the shape of a necromorph in this story, and it might be the most patient predator in the entire game. It does not lunge out of a vent or crawl through a ceiling. It hands out pamphlets. It preaches on street corners. It builds beautiful churches and fills them with quiet, reverent people, holding their arms crossed over their chests in prayer. And by the time anyone realizes what it actually wants, it has usually already had years to work. The Church of Unitology is the most successful weapon in this entire story, and it never once needs to fire a shot to do its damage. We already covered how this religion began, built on the murder of a man named Michael Altman by 2 of his own colleagues, who then reshaped his death into a founding martyrdom for a faith he never asked to lead. That origin matters, but it only explains how Unitology started. It does not explain how a lie like that survived 2 centuries, spread across every human colony, and grew into an institution with enough influence to embed itself inside the highest levels of EarthGov itself. To understand that, you have to look past the origin story and into the actual mechanics of how this church operates on the people inside it, day after day, ritual after ritual, until leaving stops feeling like an option. According to background material connected to the game, Unitology teaches its followers that the human body must never be buried or cremated after death. Instead, bodies are preserved intact aboard ships and stations, because Unitologist doctrine holds that the body is a vessel required for convergence, the promised event where all of humanity will merge into a single unified being. Followers are taught that living an unselfish life and keeping the body intact after death earns a kind of spiritual reward, an ascension into unity with every other member of the faith. It is even encouraged, according to the same sources, that followers keep their bodies in the best physical condition possible in anticipation of this outcome. Sit with the actual function of that belief for a moment. Separate from whatever spiritual meaning it claims to hold. A religion that convinces its members death is not an ending but a doorway, and that the doorway only opens correctly if the body is preserved exactly as the church instructs, has built itself an extraordinarily effective tool for controlling behavior all the way to the edge of a person's life and beyond it. There is no natural stopping point for that kind of obedience. It does not end when a follower gets old or grows tired or starts to doubt. It follows them into the grave, or rather, prevents the grave from ever closing at all. There is a framework in real-world psychology specifically built to analyze exactly this kind of structure, developed by a researcher and former cult member named Stephen Hassan. After leaving a controlling religious movement himself, Hassan spent years studying how groups like this maintain control over their members, eventually publishing what he called the BITE model, an acronym standing for behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. According to Hassan's framework, a group does not need to use all 4 categories at once to function as a high-control organization, but the more categories a group relies on, and the more thoroughly it applies them, the more completely it tends to dominate the lives of the people caught inside it. Unitology, as depicted across this franchise, checks nearly every box in that framework with an almost textbook precision, and walking through each category makes the true danger of this institution much easier to see clearly than simply calling it a cult and moving on would ever allow. Start with behavior control, the most visible layer of Hassan's model. According to his framework, this involves regulating a person's physical environment, their daily rituals, and their outward actions, often through highly specific practices designed to reinforce group identity. Unitology's meditation rituals fit this precisely. According to background sources, followers are taught to cross their arms over their chests during prayer, forming the shape of a marker with their own bodies, using replica markers, candles, and prayer mats as physical aids during these sessions. This is not simply worship in the abstract. It is a physical, repeated action performed by the body, over and over, until the posture itself becomes inseparable from the belief it represents. Behavior shapes belief just as easily as belief shapes behavior, and Unitology appears to understand that relationship instinctively. Move to information control, and the picture becomes even clearer. According to background sources, high-ranking leaders within the church have been documented fabricating or altering evidence to support Unitology's central claims, using this manufactured proof to grow their following during periods when the wider public felt genuine unease about advancing technology and unexplained events happening across human colonies. This lines up directly with what we already covered about the church's founding. Two men murdered Michael Altman and then controlled exactly which parts of his research and public statements the world was allowed to see, shaping the narrative entirely to serve the story they wanted told. Controlling information is not a side effect of Unitology's growth. It appears to be one of the primary engines driving it. This pattern of information control extends into how the church treats its own most sacred object. According to background sources, most ordinary Unitologists never actually see a real marker in their entire lives. The artifact central to their entire belief system is kept confidential, guarded jointly by EarthGov and high-ranking church officials, meaning the vast majority of believers are being asked to organize their entire spiritual lives, their rituals, their preparation for death, their sense of ultimate purpose, around an object they have never personally witnessed and have no independent way to verify even exists in the form the church describes. That detail deserves to sit uncomfortably for a moment, because it reveals something important about how this kind of institutional control actually works in practice. It rarely requires most followers to directly experience the source of their belief. It only requires them to trust the leadership's account of that source completely, and to never be in a position where they could meaningfully check that account against reality themselves. Thought control, the third category in Hassan's model, involves discouraging independent or critical thinking, often by treating doubt itself as a moral failing rather than a reasonable response. According to background sources, Unitology is explicitly noted as being opposed to individualistic and free-minded followers, actively assessing members before allowing them to progress further into the church's hierarchy. There is a documented in-game record of a follower undergoing some kind of formal testing process to determine their fitness for advancement through what the church calls indoctrination, though according to available sources, the exact nature of this testing remains unclear, and this script will not speculate beyond what is confirmed. What can be stated clearly is this: a religious structure that formally screens its own members for independence of thought and restricts advancement specifically for those who display too much of it is not organized around genuine, open inquiry into spiritual truth. It is organized around producing compliance, carefully graded and rewarded at each stage, with critical thinking treated as an obstacle to be filtered out rather than a quality to be valued. Finally, emotional control. The last piece of Hassan's framework involves manipulating a person's feelings, often through instilling specific fears, offering conditional belonging, or promising extraordinary rewards contingent on continued loyalty. This is where Unitology's actual theology does its heaviest lifting. According to background sources, the church teaches that convergence represents the end of war, the end of fear, and the end of hate, a promised state where the bodies of the dead rise united and undying, made whole through the marker. This is an extraordinarily powerful emotional promise, offering exactly what most people already want most: freedom from suffering and isolation, wrapped in language of unity and eternal belonging. But that promise comes with an equally powerful fear attached to it, one that makes leaving the church, or even doubting it, feel far riskier than simply staying. According to background sources, Unitology holds that those outside the faith are not spiritually saved after death. And in its most aggressive interpretations, the killing of non-believers has even been framed by some followers as a form of salvation being granted to them. Whether or not every ordinary member of this church believes something that extreme, the underlying structure is unmistakable. Belonging to Unitology is framed as the only path to a meaningful afterlife, and existing outside of it is framed as a kind of spiritual death sentence. That is an extremely effective way to keep people from ever seriously considering the exit. Now return to a detail from earlier in this story, one worth revisiting with this entire framework freshly in mind. Daina Le Guin spent the opening stretch of this game building exactly the kind of manufactured intimacy that makes emotional control so effective. She did not present Unitology's demands to Isaac directly. She presented herself as someone uniquely concerned with his individual survival, offering comfort and a cure precisely when he was most isolated and afraid. That approach mirrors documented cult recruitment strategy almost exactly. According to background sources connected to the game, Unitology is known to recruit aggressively, with members openly preaching in public and distributing literature without hesitation. But the deepest and most effective manipulation rarely happens through a stranger handing out a pamphlet on a street corner. It happens through relationships, through someone who seems to genuinely care, offering exactly the specific thing a vulnerable person needs most in that exact moment. There is another detail worth bringing into this discussion, one that adds a layer of personal weight to everything Isaac experiences throughout this entire story. According to background sources, Isaac's own mother was a Unitologist, and the church's system of purchasing rank through financial donation drained a significant portion of his family's resources during his upbringing. This detail is confirmed within background material connected to the franchise, and it recontextualizes something important. Isaac's disdain for Unitology did not begin the moment Daina revealed her true intentions inside this game. It began years earlier, inside his own home, watching an institution extract money and loyalty from someone he loved in exchange for promises about a destiny none of them could verify. That personal history means Isaac was never a neutral observer walking into this story's confrontation with Unitology. He arrived already carrying a specific, lived understanding of exactly what this institution costs the people caught inside its belief system, an understanding built years before any marker or any necromorph entered his life directly. When Daina reveals her betrayal, Isaac is not just discovering a new threat, he is watching a familiar pattern repeat itself on a much larger and more violent scale. The same institution that once quietly drained his family's resources, now attempting to drain something far more permanent, directly out of his own mind. This is where the true horror of Unitology as depicted in this story becomes fully visible, and it has almost nothing to do with the necromorphs the church's actions eventually unleash. The real horror is how ordinary and gradual the process looks from the inside. No single Unitologist in this story wakes up one day and decides to become a monster. According to background sources, church leadership itself may have been influenced by direct exposure to a marker's effects, meaning even the people orchestrating these events at the highest levels may not have full, undistorted control over their own judgment. The institution radicalizes from the very top, using genuinely believing followers as both instruments and casualties of a plan those followers themselves rarely have full visibility into. That is the actual engine driving Unitology's horror throughout this entire franchise. It does not require most of its followers to be cruel or fanatical in any dramatic, obvious sense. It only requires them to trust an institution that has spent 2 centuries perfecting the art of converting that trust into behavior serving the institution's goals. Regardless of the cost to the individual believer offering it, there is a wider point worth making here, one that reaches beyond this specific story and into how real-world, high-control groups tend to function, according to researchers like Hassan and others working in this field. The most dangerous manipulation rarely announces itself as manipulation. It arrives wrapped in the language of belonging, purpose, and salvation, offered specifically to people already experiencing some form of isolation, fear, or unmet need. Unitology thrives on the sprawl not because the people living there are unusually foolish or weak. It thrives because it offers something genuinely appealing: community, meaning, an answer to death itself, in a setting already defined by institutional betrayal, corporate exploitation, and a government willing to sacrifice its own citizens to protect a secret research project. Unitology does not need to invent the pain and uncertainty its recruitment feeds on. That pain already exists, manufactured by every other institution we have already examined across this story. The church simply positions itself as the answer waiting on the other side of it. That is what makes Unitology, more than any single monster in this franchise, the most disturbing antagonist running underneath this entire story. A necromorph is honest about what it wants. It will kill you, and there is no deeper layer of meaning to uncover beneath that fact. Unitology is never honest in that same way. It tells its followers they are receiving unity, salvation, and eternal belonging, right up until the exact moment those followers become raw material for an event that, when you strip away every piece of comforting language surrounding it, looks far closer to mass annihilation than anything resembling the peace it was promised to deliver. Isaac spends this entire game fighting his way through the physical consequences of that promise. The necromorphs, the outbreak, the collapsing station. But underneath all of it, he is also fighting something with no physical form at all. An institution built specifically to convert grief, fear, and the universal human need for meaning into obedience. Patient enough to spend over 3 centuries doing it, and skilled enough to make that conversion feel, right up until the very end, exactly like being saved. Chapter 15. The words he finally says out loud. Everything in this story has been building toward a moment that isn't a boss fight, isn't a set piece, and doesn't involve a single necromorph. It's a moment where Isaac Clarke finally says something out loud that he's been avoiding since before this game even started. To understand why this moment carries so much weight, you need to remember everything Isaac has been running from. Since he arrived on the sprawl, he's been hunted by Tiedemann, betrayed by Daina, forced to watch Strauss collapse into the exact kind of ruin he feared for himself, and dragged back into the Ishimura, the place where all of this began. Through every single one of those events, one presence has never fully left him. Nicole, or rather the version of Nicole his mind keeps generating, has been there the entire time, sometimes comforting, sometimes violent, always demanding something from him he's never been fully able to name. As Isaac approaches the marker near the end of the story, that presence finally forces the confrontation Isaac has spent this entire game trying to avoid. According to the game's own dialogue, Nicole's hallucination pushes him to admit exactly why he can't seem to let her go, why her image keeps returning no matter how many times he tells himself she's gone. Isaac responds by admitting the truth underneath all of it. She was the center of his entire world, and letting go of her would mean facing the fact that he has nothing left to hold on to. That admission is worth slowing down on, because it reveals something that psychology recognizes as one of the more difficult forms of grief to work through. When a person's sense of identity becomes deeply tied to another individual, especially through a relationship marked by both love and unresolved guilt, losing that person can feel like losing access to yourself as well. This is sometimes described within grief research as identity disruption, where mourning someone isn't just about missing them, it's about no longer knowing who you are without the role that relationship gave you. Isaac isn't simply grieving Nicole's death, he's grieving the version of himself that existed while she was alive, the version who still believed he could protect the people he loved, who hadn't yet been forced to watch that belief fail in the worst possible way. Every hallucination of Nicole throughout this game hasn't just been the marker torturing him with images of someone he lost. It's been Isaac's own mind refusing to let go of the last version of himself that felt whole. This is where the thesis running underneath this entire story becomes impossible to ignore any longer. From the very beginning, this game has asked you to trust Isaac's perception of events, his sense of what's real, his understanding of his own motivations, and slowly, piece by piece, the story has revealed that Isaac himself has been the least reliable narrator in his own life. Not because he's lying to anyone else, but because he's been lying to himself for years, and the game has been asking you to be complicit in that lie by trusting his point of view without question. Real-world psychology has a term for exactly this kind of protective self-deception. It's called denial, but not in the simplistic sense the word often gets used casually. Clinical denial isn't a conscious choice to ignore reality. It's an unconscious defense mechanism, one the mind builds specifically to protect a person from information too painful to fully process all at once. Isaac didn't choose to spend 3 years believing his hallucinations were purely an external marker attack, rather than partially his own unresolved guilt given form. His mind built that explanation for him because the alternative, that some of this pain was coming from inside himself the entire time, was harder to survive than believing it was something being done to him. There's a specific detail worth returning to from earlier in this story, one we mentioned would matter more the further we got. Isaac believed almost until this exact moment that his hallucinations of Nicole were entirely the marker's influence, something planted in him from outside. According to the game's own dialogue, Nicole's hallucination reveals during this final confrontation that this belief was never fully accurate. The violence and intensity of these visions weren't purely manufactured by an alien signal. They came from Isaac's own inability to make peace with what happened to her. Sit with what that actually means for everything you've watched up to this point. The game spent its entire runtime letting you assume Isaac was a victim of external manipulation, a man whose mind was being hijacked by something outside his control. And in this moment, it quietly reveals that the manipulation was real, but it was never acting alone. It was working with material Isaac's own guilt had already generated, amplifying something that was already there, rather than creating it from nothing. This is the uncomfortable idea sitting at the center of everything this game has been building toward. Dead Space 2 isn't just a story about an alien artifact that causes hallucinations. It's a story about how easily a traumatized mind can mistake its own unprocessed guilt for an external threat. Because believing something is being done to you is often easier to survive than admitting some of the damage is coming from inside your own unresolved pain. And here's where the game asks something of the player specifically, something most horror stories never bother attempting. For hours you've been controlling Isaac, seeing exactly what he sees, trusting his sense of what's real without much reason to question it. The game let you believe what he believed, because that's how first-person psychological horror works. It needs your trust in the protagonist's perception to function at all, and in this single moment, it reveals that the trust you extended to Isaac's version of events was never fully earned because Isaac himself didn't have full access to the truth of his own mind until this exact instant. That's not a plot twist in the traditional sense. It's closer to an accusation, gently delivered, aimed directly at the assumption every player made simply by picking up the controller and stepping into Isaac's perspective. You trusted him because the game gave you no reason not to, and the game gave you no reason not to because Isaac didn't fully trust himself either, and you were experiencing his blind spot right alongside him the entire time. Once this confession happens, the visions of Nicole change. According to the game's own story, her presence becomes noticeably calmer, less violent, guiding rather than attacking. That shift isn't presented as a full resolution. It's presented as the first moment Isaac stops fighting the truth long enough to actually look at it directly. What comes next is going to test whether looking at that truth is enough to survive what it demands of him. Chapter 16: The Battle No One Else Can See. Once Isaac approaches the marker in its final chamber, the story pulls him into a confrontation unlike anything else in this game. According to the game's plot details, the hallucination of Nicole draws Isaac into his own mind, a space where the usual rules of physical combat no longer apply, and where the only enemy left standing is the part of himself he's spent this entire story avoiding. Within this internal confrontation, Nicole reveals something the marker has apparently understood for a long time, something Isaac himself never consciously grasped. According to the game's own story, becoming whole again, the promise both Nicole's hallucination and the wider Unitologist doctrine of convergence have been offering this entire time, requires Isaac to fully absorb the identity of the very thing that created the marker's presence within him. In effect, becoming one with Nicole means becoming one with the artifact that has been using her image to manipulate him from the very beginning. This is where the story's central metaphor becomes almost impossible to miss: the promise of being made whole. The exact language Unitology has spent 2 centuries using to describe salvation turns out to mean total erasure of individual selfhood, a complete absorption into something larger that no longer resembles the person being absorbed. What sounds like healing is actually annihilation wearing healing's language. What sounds like reunion with someone you lost is actually the final and total surrender of who you are. There's something worth naming here about how grief, left unresolved for long enough, can quietly start to resemble exactly this kind of offer. A person struggling with complicated grief sometimes reaches a point where staying trapped in the past feels safer and more familiar than moving forward into an uncertain future without the person they lost. The idea of being reunited, even through unhealthy means, even through refusing to let go, can start to feel like relief rather than danger, because at least it's familiar, and at least it means not having to build a new version of life without what's gone. That's precisely the trap Isaac is fighting inside his own mind during this sequence. Nicole's hallucination isn't simply asking him to die, she's offering him an end to the exhausting work of grieving, a permanent escape from 3 years of guilt, hallucination, and loss, wrapped in the comforting shape of the person he loved most. Accepting her offer wouldn't feel like defeat from the inside, it would feel like finally getting to stop fighting. According to the game's story, Isaac ultimately fights back against this version of Nicole, engaging in an extended internal struggle before managing to destroy her, along with the last remnants of the marker's direct influence over his mind. The exact symbolic or narrative mechanics of what destroying a hallucination within someone's own mind actually represents are not fully clarified within available sources, and this script won't invent an explanation the material itself doesn't provide. What is clear is the outcome. Isaac survives the confrontation, and according to the game's plot, this act removes the marker's hold over him and results in the marker's own destruction as well. This moment deserves to be understood as the true emotional climax of Dead Space 2, arguably more important than any of the physical combat surrounding it. Everything Isaac has endured throughout this entire story, the betrayals, the returns to old trauma, the death of Strauss, and the betrayal of Daina, the slow unraveling of his own sense of reality, all of it funnels into this single choice happening entirely inside his own head. He isn't fighting a monster in this moment. He's fighting the version of himself that wanted to stop fighting altogether, the part of his mind that found the offer of permanent reunion with Nicole, even through his own destruction, genuinely tempting. Winning that fight doesn't erase what Isaac lost. It doesn't undo 3 years of captivity, manipulation, and grief. What it does, according to the story's own framing, is give Isaac back something closer to control over his own mind, a version of himself no longer being actively shaped by an outside signal exploiting his deepest wound. Whether that makes him healed in any complete sense is a much harder question, and it's one this story doesn't pretend to answer with a clean bow. What comes immediately after this victory is going to make that ambiguity impossible to ignore. Chapter 17. What getting out alive actually costs. Once the marker is destroyed and its influence over Isaac's mind breaks, according to the game's plot, Isaac finds himself physically and emotionally spent, ready to accept his own death as the station begins collapsing around him from the damage caused during the confrontation. He isn't rescued because he fights his way to safety. He's rescued because someone else refuses to let him give up. According to the game's story, Ellie returns in a gunship, breaking through the floor of the chamber Isaac is trapped in, arriving just before the entire section of the station collapses completely. Isaac boards the ship, and the two of them escape as Titan Station comes apart behind them, an entire city built on the wreckage of a destroyed moon finally finishing the process of its own destruction. The story doesn't end there, and what follows matters just as much as the escape itself. According to a personal journal entry Isaac writes, sometime later, found within the game's own material, both he and Ellie lost something irreplaceable during the events on Titan Station. For Ellie, that loss was physical and visible, the eye taken from her during Strauss's final breakdown. According to the same journal entry, she was eventually able to afford a replacement, though its color never quite matched her original eye, a small permanent reminder written directly onto her face of what that station cost her. Isaac's own loss, according to that same journal, is harder to point to directly. He describes it as losing a part of his soul, something with no equivalent replacement available anywhere, something no amount of money or medical technology could restore the way Ellie's artificial eye restored at least the appearance of wholeness. That distinction matters. Ellie's wound became visible and, in a limited sense, treatable. Isaac's wound stayed invisible and, by his own account, permanent. According to the same journal source, this difference eventually became part of why Isaac and Ellie's relationship, which began sometime after the events on the Sprawl, ultimately fell apart. Isaac describes Ellie wanting things she could fix, and himself as someone who was, in his own words, permanently broken. Whatever relationship the two of them tried to build in the aftermath of everything they survived together couldn't withstand the different ways each of them carried what happened to them, one visible and treatable, one hidden and, according to Isaac's own account, beyond repair. This is worth connecting to something we touched on earlier in this story, back when we discussed why Isaac chose to send Ellie away rather than let her stay and face the marker alongside him. His need to protect her, according to his own later reflection, was tied directly to his failure to protect Nicole years earlier. He wasn't just trying to save Ellie's life in that moment. He was trying to succeed, finally, at something he'd already failed at once before, using her survival to quiet a wound that had nothing to do with her at all. Real relationships often struggle under exactly this kind of weight. When one person unconsciously asks a new partner to help heal a wound from an entirely different relationship, a wound the new partner never created and can't actually resolve no matter how much they care, Ellie couldn't fix what Isaac lost on that station, because what he lost wasn't really about her. It was about a version of himself that existed before Nicole died, one that believed he could keep the people he loved safe. No amount of genuine love from Ellie could restore something that specific, something that had already been broken years before she ever met him. It's worth widening the frame here, because Isaac's story doesn't end with Dead Space 2, and understanding what came after adds weight to everything we've covered. According to background material connected to the wider franchise, Isaac spent the years following the Sprawl in hiding, eventually settling on a lunar colony, still privately convinced, according to his own personal notes, that he remained permanently altered by his contact with the marker. Evidence found in his own apartment during this period shows him unconsciously sketching marker blueprints, a compulsion he apparently couldn't fully explain or control even years removed from the events on Titan Station. According to statements from the game's own creative director and writer, later material in the franchise reframes Isaac's condition in an important way. Rather than remaining simply a man afflicted by madness, Isaac's continued sensitivity to the marker signal is described by the development team as making him something closer to what they called a herald of the markers, someone whose mind remained uniquely compatible with the signal in a way most other people's did not. According to this same creative framing, Isaac essentially represents what the necromorph ecology looks like when it finds a host suited to helping it spread further, rather than one it simply destroys outright. That reframing changes how everything in Dead Space 2 reads in hindsight. Isaac's survival throughout this entire story wasn't simply luck, or willpower, or the strength of his bond with Nicole's memory. According to the franchise's own later material, it may have been something closer to biological compatibility, his mind being exactly the kind of vessel the marker signal was always going to preserve rather than destroy, regardless of how much suffering it put him through along the way. Even his survival, in other words, may never have fully belonged to him alone. This pattern continues even further into the franchise. According to later material, during events involving another affected individual named John Carver, Isaac's own hallucinations take a different shape than Carver's do, with Isaac reportedly seeing himself surrounded by red markers and later experiencing visions involving massive entities called the Brethren Moons, demanding that he lead them toward Earth. The specifics of these later visions sit outside the scope of Dead Space 2 itself, and this script won't pretend to fully explain events belonging to a different chapter of this franchise. What matters here is the pattern they confirm. Whatever Isaac survived on Titan Station was never a clean ending. It was one chapter in something that kept finding new ways to reach back into his mind. Years and games later, long after the sprawl itself had already been destroyed, that reframes everything we watched Isaac go through across this entire story. The victory at the end of Dead Space 2, hard-fought and genuinely earned as it was never a complete escape. It was survival bought at a cost that kept accumulating interest long after the credits should have rolled, a debt Isaac would keep paying, in one form or another, for the rest of his story. Chapter 18. Building a narrator you'd trust. Everything this story does to you, every moment where you believed something Isaac believed, only to learn later that belief was incomplete, was built on purpose, by people making very specific choices about what you would see, what you would hear, and, most importantly, what you would never be told directly. To understand exactly how deliberate this design was, you have to go back to the character Isaac was before this game even started. In the original Dead Space, Isaac Clarke never speaks. According to background material connected to the franchise, this was an intentional choice by the game's creative director, who wanted Isaac to function as a kind of empty vessel, someone the player could step into completely, rather than watch from a distance. The comparison used at the time was Gordon Freeman, another famous silent protagonist from a different franchise, a character who never talks specifically so the player's own presence can fill that silence. Isaac in the first game screams, he grunts, he reacts physically to horror surrounding him, but he never once responds verbally to anyone speaking to him. And according to critics writing about the game at the time, that silence gave him a strange kind of dignity, an affecting separateness that made players want to protect him without ever fully feeling like they were him. That silence mattered for a specific reason connected directly to the story's central twist in the first game. Isaac spends nearly that entire game believing he is in communication with his girlfriend Nicole, only to learn near the end that she had already died before he ever arrived on the ship, and that every interaction he believed he was having with her was some form of hallucination generated by his own grief, combined with the marker's influence. Because Isaac never spoke during any of this, the player experienced his uncertainty without ever being given direct access to his internal reasoning. You didn't know what Isaac actually believed about Nicole's condition because he never told you. You only knew what you yourself assumed based on what you were shown. For Dead Space 2, the development team made a fundamentally different choice, and according to the game's executive producer, this decision came early and was treated as one of the most significant changes for the sequel. Isaac would now speak, react verbally, and participate directly in conversations with other characters throughout the story. According to comments from the production team, this choice was framed as a natural evolution rather than a stylistic risk. The reasoning given was straightforward on its surface. A man who survived something as horrific as the events of the first game would presumably have things to say about it, and staying silent for an entire second game exploring his psychological state in more depth would have felt, in the words of the production team themselves, silly. But giving Isaac a voice does something far more significant to the story than simply making him more talkative. It fundamentally changes the relationship between the player and the character's internal reality. In the first game, Isaac's silence forced you to fill every gap with your own uncertainty, meaning you were never fully trusting his perspective because he never fully offered you one. In Dead Space 2, Isaac now narrates his own experience directly. He reacts to what he sees. He explains what he believes is happening. He responds emotionally to the people around him in real time. And because you are now hearing his interpretation of events rather than constructing your own from silence, you begin trusting his account of reality in a way the first game never asked you to. That difference is not a minor technical detail. It is the entire mechanism this story uses to set up everything we've covered about implicating the player in Isaac's own self-deception. A silent Isaac invites suspicion by default, because you're never sure what he actually believes. A speaking Isaac invites trust by default, because he is constantly telling you what he believes. And the natural instinct while playing any first-person or close third-person narrative is to take the protagonist's stated interpretation of events as reasonably reliable, at least until the story gives you a clear reason not to. According to the game's own executive producer, this shift was described specifically as allowing Isaac to turn a corner, moving from someone defined purely as a victim of circumstances into someone with clear motivation, driven directly by his escalating conflict with Tiedemann. The same producer described Isaac's overall character following the events of the first game using a single word, broken, and stated that this brokenness was meant to be reflected throughout Isaac's actions and state of mind across the entirety of Dead Space 2. Giving him a voice wasn't simply a gameplay convenience. It was a deliberate choice to let the audience witness that brokenness directly, moment to moment, through his own words, rather than inferring it from silence and distance the way the first game required. There is a specific detail worth sitting with here, one that shows just how intentionally constructed Isaac's psychological unraveling actually was. According to background material connected to the game, Isaac's mental illness throughout Dead Space 2 was deliberately woven into references drawn from classic nursery rhymes. One particularly disturbing late-game sequence, where Isaac is forced to defend himself against a hallucination attempting to attack his own eye with a needle, was directly influenced by the well-known children's saying about crossing one's heart and hoping to die, sticking a needle in one's eye. That's an unsettling choice, specifically because nursery rhymes are, by cultural default, associated with childhood comfort and simple, repetitive safety. Taking that familiar structure and turning it into a source of visceral horror mirrors exactly what this story does to trust more broadly. Something that should represent safety and familiarity becomes, instead, a vehicle for violation. According to the same background sources, the hallucinations of Nicole throughout this game were included specifically to explore Isaac's mental state, designed to reflect both his own specific trauma and broader real-world patterns connected to grief and psychological distress. This wasn't incidental horror dressing. It was constructed with direct reference to how real trauma actually manifests, meaning the emotional accuracy we discussed in earlier chapters. The way Isaac's guilt over Nicole shaped every hallucination he experienced was not something this analysis is reading into the game after the fact. It was something the development team explicitly built the story around from the beginning. Now bring back the return to the Ishimura, something we covered in detail earlier in this story, because understanding the deliberate craft behind that sequence adds an entirely new layer to how manipulative, in the most technically impressive sense of that word, this game's design actually is. According to the game's own art director, the decision to delay Isaac's return to the Ishimura for as long as possible throughout the story was completely intentional. The ship remains visible early on, sitting in the background, deliberately planting a single unsettling question in the player's mind without ever directly confirming it. Are they really going to send Isaac back there? The team specifically chose not to treat this as an obvious inevitability the player could simply brace for immediately. Instead, they let that specific dread sit unresolved for hours, allowing anticipation itself to become one of the most effective tools in the entire game's arsenal. According to the game's audio director, once Isaac finally does return to the ship, every element of sound design throughout that sequence was constructed to mirror his descent into his own damaged psychology. The level's ambience and music were deliberately built to parallel Isaac's journey into what the audio director directly described as the depths of his own tortured mind. A specific jump scare within this sequence, according to the same source, replicates the exact sound effects from an earlier encounter with the hive mind in the first game, a choice made specifically to provoke an emotional reaction and to make both Isaac and the player question whether his Chapter 19, Why This Story Lied to You on Purpose. By the end of Dead Space 2, you've watched Isaac Clarke survive betrayal from nearly every authority figure and institution he encountered. fight his way through the physical return to the site of his original trauma, and win an internal battle against a version of grief that offered him comforting annihilation instead of painful healing. All of that would already make for a complete horror story on its own, but underneath all of it sits something quieter. Something this game never states outright, because stating it outright would ruin exactly how it works. This entire story is built around implicating you, the player, in Isaac's own self-deception, and it does this by design rather than by accident. Think back across everything we've covered. You spent this entire game seeing exactly what Isaac saw, trusting his perception because the format of the game gave you no other option. When Nicole appeared as a hallucination, you experienced her exactly the way Isaac did, uncertain how much of what you were seeing was real. When Isaac believed his hallucinations were purely the result of external marker manipulation, you had every reason to believe that too, because nothing in the story up to that point contradicted it. The game never lied to you through dialogue or false information. It let you draw the same incomplete conclusions Isaac himself was drawing, because you were experiencing his blind spot from directly inside it. That's a fundamentally different kind of manipulation than most horror stories attempt. Most horror asks you to be afraid of something you can clearly identify as a threat. This story asks you to trust a narrator who doesn't fully understand his own mind, and it never announces that you're doing this. It simply lets the mechanics of first-person psychological horror do the work. Because in order for this kind of game to function at all, you have to align yourself with the protagonist's perception almost completely. There's no other way to play it. By the time the truth comes out, that Isaac's hallucinations were never purely external, that some of the horror chasing him for the entire game was generated by his own unprocessed guilt. The game has already spent hours training you to trust exactly the perspective that turned out to be incomplete. You weren't tricked by a plot twist in the traditional sense. You were quietly implicated in the same blind spot Isaac was living inside, because the format of the experience required your trust in order to work as intended. This connects directly to something we touched on early in this story and have circled back toward ever since. Isaac's survival throughout Dead Space 2 depended on a form of denial, an unconscious refusal to fully process that some of his pain was self-generated rather than externally imposed. The game asks you to share that denial with him for most of its runtime, not because it wants to deceive you cruelly, but because that shared blind spot is the exact mechanism through which the story creates its most effective horror. You don't just watch Isaac struggle to tell what's real. For a significant stretch of this game, you struggle right alongside him, using the same incomplete information he has, drawing the same reasonable but ultimately wrong conclusions he draws. There's something genuinely unsettling about recognizing that pattern once you see it clearly. Most horror wants you to feel afraid of something outside yourself, a monster, a killer, an unknown threat lurking in the dark. This story wants something more uncomfortable than that. It wants you to recognize, after the fact, that your own trust in a familiar narrative structure, the assumption that the protagonist's perception can be relied upon simply because you're seeing through his eyes, was never fully justified here. And it wants you to sit with the fact that you extended that trust anyway, the same way people in real life often extend trust to their own perception of events without questioning whether grief, fear, or guilt might be quietly distorting what they believe they're seeing clearly. That's the real thesis running underneath everything this game does. Dead Space 2 isn't simply about an engineer fighting space monsters while slowly losing his mind. It's about how easily trust, both in ourselves and in the narratives we build to survive our own pain, can be quietly weaponized, sometimes by an outside force actively exploiting it, and sometimes by nothing more than our own mind's need to make an unbearable loss feel survivable. Isaac spent 3 years believing an external threat was solely responsible for his suffering, because that belief was easier to live inside than the alternative. And for most of this game's runtime, without ever being told directly, you believed it right alongside him. The station is gone now. The marker is destroyed. Isaac is alive, changed, carrying something invisible that no replacement eye or medical procedure could ever restore. And somewhere in the years that follow, according to material beyond the scope of this particular story, that same vulnerability that made him useful to the marker in the first place never fully goes away. It just waits, the same way this story waited, patiently for the exact right moment to reveal that the thing you trusted most clearly was never as reliable as it seemed. That's the masterpiece Dead Space 2 actually built, not a haunted space station, not a psychological breakdown rendered in convincing detail, a story engineered specifically to make you complicit in exactly the kind of self-deception it spends its entire runtime examining, and to let you realize that only once it's already too late to see it any other way. The lights on the sprawl are gone now. Isaac is somewhere out there, still carrying pieces of what happened to him that no one else can see, and whatever trust you placed in this story, in this narrator, in your own certainty about what was real and what wasn't, was never entirely yours to give safely in the first place.